How's it going, everybody? This is a Skunk Fan podcast. Today, we have a special episode. Joe Pietri, obviously, most of you have been listening and you've been following along with our series with Joe. Today, hopefully, we'll be having Nishan from Phylos Bioscience joining us just to talk about everything under the sun. And I know Joe's got some other things he wants to talk about too, so we'll go ahead and let him do that. How you doing, Joe?
Good. The reason I wanted to bring uh, Nishan on is that he spoke the skunk in the 80s. He called it roadkill, but he said he knows exactly what it was, the skunk spray and the whole bit. I listened to the podcast by Blue Skies Vienna and some other guy, somebody from Top Dog, and I just want to say one thing in support of Blue Skies Vienna is that it's a good thing that he's trying to bring back, resurrect old strains, because if any cannabis scene ever needed some help with its genetics, it's this cannabis scene. And see, my job is to put the genetics back into the weed, and what I do is I sell the building blocks where you can make off the hook strains now using pure genetics. The guy who talked about skunk and this and that in the 90s and this and that, he may have been a truthful person and stuff. He looked a bit young for me to be able to even know what the hell skunk is, truly. So I'm going to talk about that. And I just want to thank Vienna, because you got to thank everybody who's out there trying to improve the genetics after the Dutch have had it and ruined everything. So it's good to have people that are on the same team as far as genetics go. But I got my first load of skunk from was it Hot Springs, Arkansas. And in those days, they had what they called the cornbread mafia. I used to call it the hippie mafia, the hillbilly mafia. But they were selling weed. I bought weed from them in the 60s. I had a guy that would bring me what we used to call Kentucky bluegrass. It was all baled and pressed like Mexican. So it looked like Mexican kilos. There were kilos. And they were better than the kilos that people were bringing across the border, but not as good as the really carefully grown Mexican that was available at the time. It was more commercial, but this was better than the commercial at the time. And so he used to build stereo equipment, cases for stereo equipment, very out of cherry wood and really fancy hardwoods. And he would sell the cabinets in New York. And when he brought them to New York to high-end stereo stores, when he brought them to New York, they were loaded with weed. He'd sell the weed first and sell the cabinets, and he'd go back home to Kentucky. They have a cannabis history in Kentucky that goes way back, because as where Lilly started to grow cannabis at the turn of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century, at the end of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century, because they were afraid that the supplies of hemp and cannabis from the Asia would be cut off due to the U-boats and World War One. So they started growing cannabis in Mexico and in Kentucky, and for the first time you got to see cannabis sativa americana, which meant that this was cannabis that was grown here in America using the same seeds from Asia. So there was a big scene going on there. And then in the 70s and 80s, there was a type of bud of weed that was trying to compete with the Mexican market, the high-end Mexican market, high-end Jamaicans like that. And they were by the hillbilly mafia, the cornbread mafia. They were growing sensimilla. They were growing really good buds. They were selling them for the high ticket. And that was something else that came on the market in those days. And you got to remember, Kentucky is a lot closer to New York. New York was the big market for weed, always. But back in those days, they said that they smoked a ton of weed a day in New York, So he grew a lot of that. That's the first time I ever smoked skunk or was exposed to skunk was down south, and it was in the late 70s, and it happened 70s through the 80s, but then that flavor sort of disappeared. A lot of people think it's the flavor disappeared because it was it was so fragrant and so overwhelming odor that you couldn't disguise, that a lot of people just didn't want to smuggle it, didn't want to be involved with it because of the smell. They'd have to pack it 3 times, take extreme care.
But would you say that skunk had, amazing medicinal qualities compared to other strains?
Well, you have to remember one thing, that all the weed was medicinal until the Dutch got a hold on it. And then it became like stupid weed. All weed was grown for medical effect. It always has been. We wouldn't have an indoor cannabinoid system if it didn't work. But all mammals have that system. Cannabis works on pigs, cannabis works on horses, cannabis works on cows, works on any mammal. So they have endocannabinoid systems. So they couldn't keep it illegal for a while. Now they've got it all sourced out into different effects, different trichomes. Like they have CBD, CBG, THC, THCV. They have, and each one of them has a different effects. Now you got to remember, there's more than 100. There's hundreds and hundreds of different cannabinoids, all with a different effect. They haven't really, they haven't found the uses for other cannabinoids yet. They probably will find the new ones, but it's always been the most important medicine. And basically, they waited for the weed to be legal, and they DNA'd it. That went for the science to catch up with weed, and then it became legal again. Now they're selling you, diet pills, speed pills, all these other kind of things from probably effects that you get from different forms of cannabis. We won't know because it's the pharmaceutical companies. But we everybody talks about freedom and America's free and all. As long as the pharmaceutical companies run it, dude. They tell you what to eat, what you need to eat to help you eat, what you need to sleep, what you need not to sleep, what you need for pain, what you don't need for pain, all these other kinds of stuff. I mean, they created morphine to cure opium addiction. They created morphine, they created heroin to combat morphine addiction. Now they got fentanyl. That's basically the whole the whole pharmaceutical industry is based on recipes that they copied from it. They copied when they went to India in the 1840s.
Hey, Nishan.
Nishan, how are you?
Good, yourself? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Oh, but we just got joined by Nishan of Phylos Bioscience. We get to play with him and ask him a few questions. One of the things is, when was the first time you smoked a skunk? And by the way, Nishan, he grew up in a commune. His father was a hippie. He's like the offspring of the hippie culture of the 60s, who's now a scientist, a cannabis scientist. He smoked the skunk that we know in the 80s. Can you tell us what you remember of it?
Yeah, I mean, it was, sort of when I was growing weed as a, teenager, and I don't know, this maybe when I was 15, 1985 or something, in Eugene, and there was just, I don't even remember what we called it, but because it really didn't have names. It's just the guy came over to your house and gave, sold you some weed. but it was, I mean, it was the skunk that it was like you driving down the road and there's a skunk on the side of the road and it smells like maybe your bag of weed opened in your pocket. That's what, and you're scared because you're with your mom. Not that my mom was really freaked out about me smoking weed, but like I was 15. Yeah. I mean, it was, which I guess, right, they call roadkills, or they sort of named roadkill skunk right now, right?
There's a big dispute now, because not a dispute, it's just basically people trying to find the real skunk again. I've smelt it, but the guy, there was a young kid, he wouldn't, when he looked at me, he said, "What are you, a cop?" Because I was old, but I have smelt it. I know that it's out there. And so Vienna has some original skunk weed seeds that he's blended, he's crossbred to save the strains, as most people do. And so a lot of people have been trying to copy what he's doing and take credit for what he's doing. And they're basically all taking credit for stuff that was done a long time ago. And when I first came on, met Nishan, I asked him, I said, why did you name it after the skunk, man? The guy's a DEA agent, why would you name it after him? Because now everything starts with skunk number one. And one of the things that I want to make people understand is that skunk number one ain't skunk. When you go to look at skunk in the Phylos Bioscience DNA sequencing, they have 3 or 4 different kinds of skunk, and they all have some that are more hemp, some that are more skunk, some that are more hemp skunk, and some berry and some other flavor and some CBD. Nothing is like pinpointed out. When I asked Nishan this, he said, because none of that is real.
Well, so let me step back a second, right? I don't know. We were doing a study of diversity in germplasm in sort of populations and trying to see what was what and whether there were different populations or how it all looked, right, in terms of genetic similarity. And, using a fairly large but relatively small, relative to like what you need to breed with or something, marker set, right? So it's a population set of markers. There are about 2,000 markers, which for the human population, we use about 50, right? Or people use 50 to sort of differentiate different populations. So there were, through a number of ways of looking at the data, there were, I think it's 6, maybe they're called clades, but, sort of groupings of, you might call them kind of similarity sets, right? So they share enough of the same markers to be considered part of the same group. And theoretically, those are traits, but those markers may not be actually associated with traits. But it's a way to differentiate populations based on mutations, right? And that's diverse across the population that we saw. So we used names, but the names are arbitrary, right? The names of those populations or clades, those sets are like hemp, landrace, OG Kush, skunk, berry, CBD, I think, right? And really, those are arbitrary because they are just, certain sets, people had submitted plants inside of those sets. And then we were like, well, here's some representative ones. But so the problem is that, you, Joe, have a passion for skunk. And I think you have a passion for roadkill skunk, not skunk number one, but have always given me a hard time for that naming. And it's arbitrary. It doesn't mean that skunk, if something has skunk in it, it shows in the population, it doesn't mean it has skunk in it. It means that the plants the plant's genetics, whatever that one plant is, has similar markers to the family that makes up for the label skunk. And it's a label only. It's not necessarily that it's a skunk plant or a family. It's just that there were a bunch of skunk in there. And I think part of the reason that was done was because, skunk was in there and it shared a lot of the same stuff. But, and it just so happens, right, that in Europe, they used skunk #1, which is the Dutch sweet, right, to cross into a lot of stuff because it was, the most stable, I think, at the time. And so it was the most stabilized traits that would come through in the crosses. But, there's, cannabis is it's an obligate outcrosser, which, ultimately it has a lot of inbreeding depression. So that means that the plants that would be the best to use for crossing do not express the best, if that makes any sense.
So in most cases, you whatever individual plant you're looking at, if you see an amalgamation of stuff that would be from Acapulco Gold or Colombian, things that make up what you guys are calling skunk, right? Basically, that's one of those families is going to get lumped in with skunk and be called that, right? That's basically
So that's a label. If you just say like group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, group 5, group 6, right? You could call them that if you wanted to. We were just putting a label on there to go like, hey, there's some skunk. The samples that David Watson sent into us were from, we're called skunk. There's other ones in there also called skunk, and we don't know who had. Theoretically, David has the ones that he had, right, that he labeled, but other ones we have no idea about their validity. And so it became like a Google reference point, right? Like, hey, this is what this person is calling it, and it's all, someone else is calling this clone the same thing, like OG Kush, for example, or Sour Diesel or whatever. But those are just individual plants inside of a grouping of plants, which had that arbitrary grouping on them, right? Landrace. Those aren't necessarily the only land races in there. We just labeled it that way. And it looks like those are probably the narrow leaf drug varieties, right? Which happen to be more likely to be land race because people don't grow them commercially.
But it doesn't, with as much sharing that's going on, you guys can really, I'm imagining you can only go off what you're being told too, about the origins.
Oh, yeah, we didn't grow any of those. We were just getting pieces of stem in the mail, and you can't do anything with it other than, sequence it. We could sequence those, but that's about it. And then people are telling you stuff, and it's hard, right? Because modern cannabis, has these sort of used terms that mean different things, right? Like indica and sativa, whatever that means. I probably, and I don't know, I won't even go there, but that means something, and they probably mean really nothing anymore, other than maybe people use them to mean uplifting versus sedative, right? But people also use them for morphology, and so that's where things get messed up, right? Is where you're using them for both morphology and effect.
It's all the same plant. It's just where it grows, it begins to grow differently.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of traits, right?
Yeah.
Really quite amazing from equatorial versus northern climate plants, right? Or dry climate. There's cold islands.
They acclimatize. They change to the climate. So when you take a plant from one ecosystem and take it to another ecosystem, it develops differently.
Well, it develops, but you also are. you are making crosses with it. And then those plants and there's variation, and then those plants that you've selected that do better, theoretically they mature in time before they rot, right? You keep those. And so that's the process of selection. And that's how things change, right? Is family to family. I mean, they can do it naturally too, right? But humans like weed. So we want to keep it around. And so we select it faster for the traits that matter, which is making it onto the next season and having weed to smoke, right? Or make into hash or whatever you're trying to do with it, right?
Would you mind, not to derail the conversation, but I'm interested in the ship ballast, the sample you guys found in the ship, someone found in the ship ballast, and then you guys had
The
sequenced.
ship ballast.
Maybe just talk about like finding that, what you guys learned from that, and then also if there's any other finds that you guys have sequenced throughout the world.
I want to make one little comment before we let Nishan talk about that. I just want to say that was like the most exciting thing that I ever saw on your on the gallery. That really made my day.
1879 ship ballast, yeah.
That made my day.
That I think came from Rutgers University. It was a sort of a nice find, and
they had skunk in it.
Yeah, right. Well, it shares the same markers that the population that's called skunk has in it as the majority of theirs. So that's a weirdly long-winded thing, but it's significantly different than people thinking that it has skunk number one or the skunk plant or the skunk genes in it, right? Because it's way earlier. So it just shares some of the similar markers, family tree, right?
Right. And basically that was the point that I said from the very beginning. I said, no. That's the stuff that Jefferson and Washington smoked on their fucking porch. The sweet hemp.
I mean, well, smokable hemp is just weed, right? I mean, and there's references to that all the time, but because we didn't have the Europeans didn't call it marijuana or cannabis, they called it hemp. And there's smokable version versus the industrial version, right? And anyways, the 1879 sample was interesting. It's puzzling, and we still don't really know exactly, but I found it interesting.
But I was right. I was right.
You were right. Sorry, I don't understand.
Right, that I knew that he had nothing to do with that was been around for a long, long time. And I said that looked like to me like it was an Afghani. Remember?
Oh, I see. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it shows up in the sort of modern drug cult of our population, which was puzzling initially, right? But to me, it seems much more likely, right? So that the OG Kush and the sort of modern cannabis, that isn't all that different, from the older stuff, right? There are older populations in there that are very similar. I mean, we think of it as if, we invented it in the last 50 years or something, but people have been growing this for thousands of years, right? And it's funny, like I saw there's a common post, I think, that the High Times had, like, not your mother's weed or whatever, and it has all these really kind of crappy pictures of cannabis, from wherever, Colombian and Thai and all that. And really, I find it funny because, there's a lot of people also that argue, like, look at the potency of cannabis over a period of time. And really, if you look at that, most of the DEA busts were over the Mexico-US border. And, but like most of the probably higher quality or higher potency cannabis came from, not from Mexico, mainly probably because it was brickweed, right? And so, and non-sensimilla, so the common denominator was including stems, and so your potency was lower. And so as the weed, became better trimmed or better quality, or stripped off the stalks, the potency just increased because, you get rid of the stuff that doesn't have any potency in it. But to me, I thought the Shipvala stuff was interesting because, really, we've been moving this stuff around the world for hundreds of years. And
Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
1779, that was like
1879, dude.
That's late, right? A couple hundred years in.
Oh yeah, when you look at the record of the Spanish and how much cannabis they grew, all of the coast of of Chile, the whole coast. At once, when I was there in the 60s, it was all cannabis.
Yeah,
that's where the Spanish ships, if they went around the Horn and they had to repair, because in those days going around the Horn was a tough thing. You had to be a good sailor.
Well,
and like a feat to go around the Horn. When they went in, they had a place where they could buy new sails, get sails made, new ropes, anything they needed, they could have right there. So the Spanish built up hemp colonies all around where their ships sailed.
Right. Well, I had heard that essentially Jamestown was exporting smokable hemp to England and disrupted the Spanish supply. And they made a huge amount of money from.
I'm so glad you said that, Nishan. Because that's an important aspect for everybody to see how the making cannabis illegal for a human being is a crime against humanity. It's used in so many medicines and so many things. Our whole lives, we evolved with it. So I mean, and it's to hear that is it's refreshing. It really is.
Yeah, I mean, we all know, the stories, right? Of how it became, illegal and pushed underground. And I mean, the funny thing is, there's a sort of a law that says that cannabis, or really anything that becomes illegal, gets more dangerous and more concentrated when it's made illegal. And hash making and some of these things, were made even further into that because it could get through borders, right? If it was concentrated. I don't think that cannabis is necessarily more dangerous, in a concentrated form, but, other things like cocaine and various things can, opium, right, can become more dangerous when pushed underground because you need to concentrate.
They created morphine to kill the addiction to opium, and then they created heroin to kill the addiction to morphine, and now they got fentanyl.
Yeah.
And now you can in I guess it's Colorado, you can buy mushrooms.
Oh, wow, yeah. I mean, I know that places, even in Oregon, it's made, it's now legal to have small amounts. So it's decriminalized for small amounts, many drugs, I think.
I think they should just make, hey, they're going to take them anyway. Give it to them. Get them off. Give them therapy like they do in Switzerland.
Yeah.
And they have addicts. You go there, they took the addicts off. I remember when you went to Switzerland, the addicts would attack you when you came out of the subway there, dude. You know what I mean?
Well,
and what they did in Amsterdam is they made everything legal, and they made places where they could go, and the addicts could go and use their medication with their syringes, everything clean. And at the same time, they had doctors there and nurses there, and they gave them therapy. And people who went to those shops that were to get their their allowance of drugs and take their drugs, they came out of addiction and stayed off addiction.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you look at it in your face. And what I've seen through my life, I'm 75 now, is that when addicts have a way to go every day, they know they can have their fix. Every day they know that they can go to the shop corner on the shop and get a fix. And the doctor will give alcohol on your thing and supervise everything, and you can do it there all you want. And once you start doing it on that level, and it's easy. That's what kills it. It's easy. You get bored. And then that's how you conquer addiction.
Yeah.
That's
I
how
think
you
that,
conquer addiction. And some of the things that, everybody says Joe's anti-Dutch. I'm anti-Dutch on certain things, but some things that they did very well. And that's one of the things I know, because at that point they have time to think.
yeah,
They don't have to source it. They don't have to get money to source it. They don't have to do any of that stuff. It's there for you.
yeah. My understanding is that Portugal's model is slightly
Portugal's model is the best in the world.
yeah. Whereas the Dutch model, I think, is just decrimmed, and so it's not actually able to be produced or sold or anything like that. But anyways, getting back to cannabis, so the skunk, I'm curious what I guess I'm not sure.
It's Jeff and Joe.
Jeff and Joe. Okay, what the skunk project you guys are doing?
Well,
So
everybody's trying
basically,
to identify the skunk, if anybody
so-
really has it.
So basically, the genetics that we're working with they never went to Holland. And they were from a private collector. They were seeds that were remade from a private collector who was collecting land races from all over the world, purchased seeds from the hippie trail. His name was Old Timer One. He recently passed away.
Okay.
And then, reproductions of those were made, and there's all kinds of different variations of the old school skunk smell, all kinds of different acrid ones and things like that. Honestly, it's just it's something, we're all interested in. So,
and are those similar to the selection? There's another Old Timer One selection.
So these one would have originated from the ESB haze. And
okay, yep.
You're familiar with the Old Timer seeds?
Me, yeah.
Okay, good.
And there's a lot of controversy about it, and I'm really there's a lot of opinions. In my opinion, I'm growing them, and they're very what I'll say is they're very unique and very amazing plants. And I just enjoy hunting and finding new things. And for me, honestly, there's all kinds of really cool stuff that you can find in there that you just don't see anymore.
Have you sequenced this stuff, the Old Timers one?
I don't know. I'm not sure. Possibly.
It would have been, he's basically famous for using African sativas,
Yep.
Things like that.
So
Ethiopian and
you know who he is.
Cool. That's very cool. And so are they long? I mean,
basically he was known for domesticating these longer flowering sativas and kind of taming them a little bit and shortening the flowering time and making them more indoor appropriate. And
are you seeing a bunch of thiols or that skunky?
Oh yes. Very, very strange putrid smells. They attract flies. Flies it's just they're putting cadaverine or whatever these other nasty putrefaction terpenes. And I've just seen a lot of different combinations that you just don't see. I have a plant that's heavy pine, and also a nutty almond butter, a pine butter is what I call it. And all kinds of others. I have a purple grapefruit skunk that's really loud grapefruit smell.
Interesting. And are the plant? I mean, they're long cycles, right? Long cycle plants.
No, honestly, especially with using Joe's light schedule, I actually just finished some in just 8 weeks. So I mean, I couldn't. Now, don't get me wrong. There are variations that are more sativa leaning that are longer flowering for sure. But
and you're talking about from start, right? You put them straight in instead.
No, well, I do usually a 4 to 5 week veg just until they show sex, and then just because I'm pretty sure that's how you get the highest genetic expression. Just maybe that's wrong. I'm not sure. I've been told that that you wait till the plant shows sex and then you flower to get the true expression of the plant. But that's just what I do. And Yeah, they are very, very interesting plants. And, it got me like, there's a lot of controversy around skunk, and that's what got me really like interested in it and reading old forum stuff and trying to find just the, because there's different time, there's different eras and things change
yeah, right. And
drastically.
I understand what you're saying, but it's really hard. Like the other day, you had some guy on with Vienna, and he was talking about skunk, like
Probably an old podcast that he just recently re-uploaded, if it's a new one.
it's just for me to even talk to someone who even knows about skunk, if they're not at least 50, 60 years old, they don't understand.
Absolutely.
I mean, people, I say Thaiweed. I mean, Thaiweed was so good. I mean, it was top dollar shit, dude. It was 5,000-6,000 a key, even more for the top. I mean, that's in the 70s. I mean, when you talk about Hawaiian, that was so good. I don't know if you spoke that stuff that came in the Happiness Dragon things with seal. That stuff was going for $375 an ounce, $6,400 a pound in New York in the 70s. Imagine how good that stuff what you would get for that stuff today. I mean, I look at these kids and they come up with this weed. It's like, well, I mean, it's weed has gone downhill. So anybody that's bringing back the old, thank goodness for that, because that's what I've been doing ever since I got into this game, because I want that old Thai flavor. I want that old, Mexican fucking bomb, dude. I want that old Jamaica. I don't go to Jamaica to smoke Dutch treat. You know what I mean? I think that's, and that the Dutch would try to like make a cannabis like tulips is really like if there is such a thing as a mortal sin, then that's a mortal one.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, learning about all this stuff has really been an amazing experience, Joe. Your wealth of information, and I think that you help put a lot of things in perspective, because you were, you've been through it all, and so you got an interesting standpoint on everything. So it's been nice having you on, honestly.
I mean, having Nishan on, that's been so. I got some information that I really didn't know. So thankful. The 1879 thing about 1879, and you talking about the trade that was going on there. See, I'm preparing a PowerPoint presentation to the Nepalese government. They're on the verge of legalization, and some of these kids have come on to me, and they take me as a hero because I wrote the book, The King of Nepal, and all this other stuff that I've done. And I've been there. I was in old Nepal. Old Nepal is old. It's a completely modernized Nepal today. But these kids want to make it legal. They all went to college and everything, graduated here and all this stuff, and they want to have their free country back again. And they're making a big push to legalize there. Hemp is already legal, but a lot of things that they don't know is that the Nepalese government is going around doing what the pharmaceuticals dirty work, destroying all their genetics, putting people in jail. You know what I mean? Well, meanwhile, the only one that's left with the genetics is them. I mean, you have people. You have people who have, as an example, you have people who claim to have had DNA sequenced their seeds that they came back from Nepal, and basically because they brought those seeds from Nepal, they think that they own them. You know what I mean? So, I mean, the Nepalese government is like, they may have had a socialist revolution, though it's not being run. Now they're joining forces. Let's hope. The Nepal is on the ripeness. It would be really, really good for fucking Nepal to come out and say the drug war ended here. We're never going to play your drug war again, and change everything back. Some things back. In Nepal, they could be charging everybody that comes into Nepal. They're begging for tourists, right? They want. I tell them, you're begging for tourists, and you need to bring the fucking love back here, dude. We went to Vietnam. People ran away from getting away from the war in Vietnam. They went to Nepal. They went to Thailand. They went out of the country. I had one doctor friend who walked up and down the Himalayas giving free medicine away, and they finally caught him and sent them back, and you fucking put them in jail or sent them to Vietnam, man. It was fucking strict in those days. Nepal to us was like a freedom place. It was a freedom place. Everybody was loving. There was, you know what I mean? the cops had sticks. You know, I mean, what kind of, they call Lati, you know what I mean? It was a different place, and they need to bring that love back. And I told him, I said, man, everybody here wants to, everybody's legal everywhere else but here. This is the mother of fucking Nepal. Mother Shiva is the mother of fucking India, man. Are you kidding? This is the place of Shiva. I said, man, we're not going to give it to them free. We're going to tax them when they come to the airport. They can come in, get a license, a marijuana license. They can go to registered marijuana shops and buy marijuana and temple balls from dispensaries. They buy their like $25. They can go to any defense. Restaurants can buy this licenses that they can have restaurants where they can smoke and serve food made out of cannabis. Right? The farmers get a license. They sell to distributors. They get a license. Distributors sell to the shops. They have everybody has a license. Everybody gets money from the minute that a tourist comes in. Why would anyone want to go to Nepal? It's free here.
Yeah.
Go to Nepal for the mountains and the temples. Okay, but we want the temple balls. Dude,
Hey, Joe.
It's a slam dunk for Nepal just on licensing alone. Let's say they got 2 million tourists or 1 million tourists a year come to Nepal. That's like $50,000 in licensing fees, $50 million in licensing fees.
Yeah.
And when they go home, they have a souvenir of their trip to Nepal. Oh, I had a license in Nepal, and I went to a government shop and I bought temple balls. You know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, they're squealing for money in Nepal. They're hungry for money in Nepal. Well, if they're hungry for money in Nepal, bring back the love, dude.
Yeah, for sure.
Stop putting people in jail for what we used to give away free, where everybody grew with. You know,
are typical in Nepal. What smell profiles?
Yeah. I remember Asansol Market, the spice market there. It had a smell.
I meant for weeds. That's a whole nother thing that's amazing, right? Just the general one. But what are the sort of weed? What's a typical sort of range? Of smell.
There was different types of Nepali weed. There's stuff that was like ropash. Remember ropash? I don't know. This is way back. The first Nepalis we used to get were ropash, was like a spaghetti fingers. Spaghetti fingers come from the Rara Lake region of Nepal, and we used to go up there and get it in those days. And those spaghetti fingers, it was black on the outside, the fingers, and then like they'd roll about maybe 40, 50 or 30 sticks, and then they would roll them together into a long stick. But when you saw it, it was made out of like 30 long sticks. And that stuff we used to fly into Kathmandu, and then go into the custom shed and pay 35 rupees a kilo and $3.50, and then you could take it home. That was it.
Hey, not to cut you off, Joe, but while we have Nishan here, do you care if I ask him a couple questions?
Yeah.
Okay. How have things changed with sequencing it since something like Phylos started? Like, if you don't mind talking about where the technology is at today. And I've also like curious if it's ever going to be possible for home growers to test our own stuff.
Well, we ended up stopping doing the Phylos, external testing, and I actually personally thought it was probably one of the most valuable things people could do, because you could validate that your cut of whatever was similar to someone else's cut, and understand how much of inbred it was, and so that's kind of a critical piece, because it's just names otherwise, and really it's, for the longest time, I'd get a cut of something, before it, and people are like, yeah, this is the real whatever, and depends on who it is and who they got it from. Your friend could be super trustworthy and they did tell you the truth, but 3 people back, didn't. And so it was a real hard thing, right? But you could validate it based on the population versus based on someone who's said that this is the real thing, right? and we got criticized quite a bit that we didn't go to X person and Y person and Z person and get the real cut of whatever. But I think getting it, and there's potential upside and downside of that method. But getting it from a wider set of people gives you confirmation. And, because, CSI Humboldt or AJ or Jason Pinsky or Josh D or whoever it is that submitted that sample said that it was called this. And then there's a bunch of other people that are calling it something the same or similar. It creates a lot of validation that one person might not be able to do, or one person could game the system with, right? Whether that's, I don't know. There's a bunch of weird history on various varieties, right? But I'll just give an example. I don't know what I think in Humboldt they call it like green ribbon or sunset, sherbet sunset, or there's a bunch of different names for it, I think, but it's got that, that the smell, right, is kind of that, I don't know what you call it, but that gelato, that distinctive gelato, which to me is like yeast. It's like a floured yeasty thing. And I think that's why they call most of their varieties like it's cookies. How's that smell? It's, apple fritter. It's got that yeasty kind of smell, which is pretty satiating, right? But, though that cut, is not the same cut as now the cookie family's sherbet, which I think is now like sherbet stout or something like that. But theoretically, someone could do a breeding project and one got released and it's called X, and then they continue breeding on it and selecting for lots of different traits, and then call the new one that thing that no one else has, right? So it's like validation of plants and what you call something is just going to be a challenge a lot of the time, right? Because it depends on who's calling it that, and if it got renamed. And there's a lot of incentives to rename stuff because sometimes cuts leave places that have them. I mean, I don't know, Jai basically said that his place got broken into 3 times or 4 times and cookies was stolen from his house, back in the day, right? So from a sequencing perspective, I mean, we don't use the Galaxy. It's not actually all that useful for our internal projects, just because it doesn't give us any more information than the raw data itself does.
That raw data that you give at Phylos is very helpful to the grower breeder.
Yeah, and that raw data, we don't use the actual population data. I don't think that I mean, there may be some kind of crossover, but I don't think so, of the markers that were used in the Galaxy. I thought that was really valuable just because it gave a sort of a larger scope of what a variety was and how you compare it to others, sort of generally what the population was, because you could then move in other directions, or you could say, yes, that really is Chem 91 or really is OG Kush or whatever that is. And you can kind of understand if it might be a good parent line, right? I mean, in a very sort of general way, but it still is good information, mainly because cannabis is prone to inbreeding depression, right? And so you inbreed it and it becomes sterile in like 5 generations, and so it's a difficult plant to work with and create consistency, consistent seed lines, which is why very few do it.
One question though, in Kazakhstan, those plants are replicating themselves for like centuries.
Oh,
it's growing in the wild.
Yeah, because they're constant. There's variation in the population. They're just crossing and recrossing. That's not. I'm talking about like a selfing, a inbreeding line, or like you could do it with SIB crosses as well. But even a SIB cross, there's variation, right? More variation than a selfing line. Selfing lines, right, are, end up stacking bunches of recessive traits that wouldn't normally show up in other, or it wouldn't show up as much. Does that make sense? So it creates.
Someone, Watson, when he opened up his bank in Holland, he used self seeds.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, I know you and David or whatever or Watson are not. You don't see eye to eye. You both don't like each other. But I mean,
I'm
it is
Dr. Watson, and he's, what's the other guy's name? The evil guy?
I don't know.
Kevorkian, Dr. Kevorkian, or Jekyll?
Yeah, there you go.
Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, or something.
Anyways, so I mean, feminization, there's a lot of rumors about it, but the reason that feminization is used is because you can actually understand the trait from both sides of the parental lines. It's a difficult thing to understand the male lines, and really, I mean, and who knows, maybe there's less hermaphrodism, maybe there's not. It's probably just a selected trait, but it's useful to know both sides of the parental lines in terms of their expression. And it isn't, I know, it isn't necessarily, this is an opinion, of course, but the male traits really carry on to the male plants. And so since we don't use the male plants from a production standpoint, except for crossing with, they don't necessarily have as much value, right? So understanding the female characteristics, which is what we grow, tend to be more sought after, right? Males have more vigor and a whole bunch of other things, but those traits don't necessarily cross over to the females.
That's why I only do F1. I create F1 from landrace, and I'm giving the building blocks back.
Well, in F1 is theoretically, the land races have had a long time to create some narrower set of traits, right? But they're not necessarily inbred. They just have a narrow set of traits. There's still diversity inside of there. But interestingly, like if you look at the Columbian stuff in the galaxy, unfortunately, I think that the visual part of the galaxy is no longer alive, I think, but there's some Columbian lines, and the relatives of those Columbian lines, like there's a Raziel and another one from some collections in the late 60s that were Columbian stuff.
The gallery was a very important thing for growers and breeders, and for people who want.
The reports are still available, so those
it was very important for us. It's very important for us. It was expensive, but important.
Yeah, no, and they're all still available, so you can go see them. You just don't see them on the three-dimensional map. It's a lot of work to maintain that. But all the data, the critical data, is all there. The Columbian stuff, because it was more. The population was more homozygous in terms of or more similar, more uniform in terms of the traits, and individual plants were more homozygous. It showed as immediate family to plants that were more recent, but also of the same general. They were plants that were separated in time by whatever from 1967 or something till whatever 2017 2018, but they showed immediate family, which is just not possible. But the reason is because they shared so many similar traits. You end up having to pick you end up having to pick how you calculate similarity. And if everything is an F1, which is just each side of the DNA is different, versus something like those Columbian lines where almost all of it is the same on both sides of the DNA, at least for those markers looked at, you look at it and go, well, if it shares half on the F1 side, because most of the cannabis population is heterozygous, right? It's crossing a mutt to another mutt and then calling it a breed, right?
Yeah.
And
somebody did to us the other day. He said, I bred a variation of skunk to another variation of skunk that looks similar. They're F1.
Yeah, but they're both mutts.
Hybrid.
Right. I mean, and the way, a real easy way, right, for people to understand what the variation inside of a population is, without a genetic test, is to self a plant and then grow out however many 100 of the offspring and look at the variation there. And if there's low variation, it means it's more stabilized. If there's a high amount of variation, then it's basically an F1. And just know that most stuff out there is mutt to mutt to mutt. And so in a weird way, you get these mutts that have, they're wildly different, but share similar traits. And so, people complain that cannabis is, sort of not the same as it was back in the day, and it just really is true. It's got a lot of the similar smell profiles because most of those were selected within that population, and it's mostly those it seems like a lot of the Afghani stuff, right, or OG Kush. There are some samples in the OG Kush family, whatever that is, population, I should say, that are Afghani. Right. And so that 1879 shipwreck sample, these are all guesses, right? We don't know. You'd have to do a lot more work, and a lot of that history of that historical record is gone. So it's difficult to determine what really is what. And we had oops, sorry. Where was I? I'm sorry, I lost track of.
I'm talking about the ship ballast sample.
Oh yeah, the ship ballast. So that is that is in that OG Kush, or is it in the skunk population? I can't remember which. I think it was in the OG.
It had some OG Kush in there. OG Kush showed up in a lot of places.
Was the majority? Well, it's not OG Kush. It's the OG Kush set of markers. So OG Kush itself is just a plant.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we messed up. We named some of these groupings after a plant that was, that was highly representative, right? But it isn't the family, and which is why people are like, well, how come this landrace has OG Kush in it? Well, it's not that. It has pieces of DNA that also OG Kush has in it. The plant OG Kush, but the family of plants or the grouping of plants share a lot of the same.
It's in there. You've just isolated it.
You're joking.
No?
No. So think about it, right? So if you have 2,000 SNPs and there's 6 families, divide 2,000 by 6, and there's a couple hundred samples, hundred pieces of marker mutations in each set of families that is representative of that grouping, right? And so, this is not the way they are, but like if you were able to say it's purple, and only purple showed up in that OG Kush family, and there was a little bit of purple DNA in the landrace one, it wasn't that OG Kush itself was in it. It's just that it has that piece of DNA that's common in the other population.
Yeah.
Like it's like looking at mutts, dogs, and going, well, that kind of looks like a Cocker Spaniel.
Yeah.
Well, oh yeah, but that's just the nose.
Cockerdoodle.
Yeah, I mean, but even, I mean, a cockerdoodle is like an F1 hybrid, a true F1 hybrid, right? Because you're taking like a labradoodle. You're taking a black lab, which you cross to a black lab to a black lab is a black lab, and a poodle to a poodle is a poodle. And so you cross those two together and you get a labradoodle half and half. And now when you cross,
when you have F1 and you breed them together after you've bred them, you
get variation across the parental lines.
You get across the line. So you get an African and an Indian, and you cross the F1 into F2 land, and you get two strains.
Well, no, I mean, so if you go back to the dog example, which is an easier way to think about it, right? You cross to F2, and that's a fun population because you get dogs that look like poodles that love sticks, right, and have curly hair, or you get straight-haired poodles that like sticks, like chasing sticks. You get variation across the parental line, but you only get that showing up in the expressed form of those parents when they're inbred. Otherwise, you're getting just a huge mix of recessives and all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, not that you don't get that in an F1 as well, but there's just less of it, because you're getting stuff. You're getting four times the variation, kind of, or well, not four times, way more than that. But because both sides of the DNA are different in both the parents, you're getting a mix of all four of those sides in random ways. Whereas
is that what causes hybrid vigor?
Hybrid vigor, I mean, hybrid vigor is no, it's more hybrid vigor. I'm not the perfect person for this, but my understanding of it is that basically when you have inbred lines from different wide enough population differences, right? Then you get a 1 + 1 = 3, because the combination of them is widely different. But when you cross even inbred lines without enough variation between the lines, then you may not get that hybrid vigor. Because
you only get hybrid vigor when you're breeding two landrace strains.
You can, yeah, depending on where those. I mean, landrace is a wide term, right? And there's, but depending on if it really is a landrace or not, or
that's the one thing I totally agree with you. And that's the reason I went to Phylos. That's the reason. I'll tell you the reason I think I like Phylos, is because I got a DNA sequencing. I got the truth that I could see it in black and white. It gave me confidence. It showed me what I had or what I was getting, and who, it showed the truth, because some people say, oh, this is this, and it's actually that. So with Phylos, you could find you had record. It was like artwork.
Yeah, you could actually see what was going on, to the degree that we were able to, right? And I love the tool, personally, and I think that probably people didn't use it to its full extent, but it was a public tool. None of the data was private. Well, yeah, I mean, and so in that way, Kevin McKernan, who has medicinal genomics, actually uses the Phylos marker set for his test. And so, you can still get a sequence. I think it's quite a bit more expensive, partly probably because the reason that we shut that down was because it was not covering as enough of the cost. So Kevin's charging a sustainable price for it. And And I mean, it doesn't show some of the things that we had, and it doesn't have the three-dimensionality, but really people need, you need to know, I don't think he has it. You need to know if it's the same as another plant, right? That's critical. Another one is, sort of the homozygosity or heterozygosity of a plant, which I believe he does have. It's uniqueness. I don't think he has family, but ultimately clonal, knowing that it's the same as another plant, and heterozygosity versus homozygosity seems like two of the most critical pieces in my view, what I think are valuable at least.
Well, I tell you something, Phylos has helped me immensely just for the knowledge. But the thing about, I'll tell you how they really help is an example is somebody came up to me and they said they thought this strain was nice. It had red stems. It was purple. And they called it blueberry muffin. So I spelled a bunch of them. I said, no, this ain't blueberry muffin. This is grape ape. I made this shit 30 years ago 20 years ago when I worked for Brett Bogue. When I did some work for Brett Bogue, you see it today, Tahoe OG, Skywalker OG, that's all my shit.
No. Those two, Tahoe OG is actually just OG Kush, I believe. Same with Ghost OG and...
Well, I bred it to my OG Kush. It has a lemony flavor. Personally, it's my plant, yeah.
But that's a hybrid, right? So OG Kush is a clone, and that, I mean, the history of OG Kush is kind of interesting. I know there's a lot of rumors about it, but there's a guy, Alex, who was in Florida and bought some weed from this surfer guy and popped some seeds. His friend, what's his name? Matt Berger, came across the country and I think dropped it off in like New Orleans, and TK Origins, Triangle Kush was there, and they called it Triangle Kush, and then it went to LA, and a whole group of guys blew it up in LA, and then it was just the Kush, and then it became OG Kush because everybody started calling their weed Kush because it was good weed and wanted to market it, and then it went out. I can't remember the guy's name, on a forum and basically got spread. And then it got sort of, Tahoe OG and Ghost OG and a number of OGs at that point in time. And then now everybody's calling their stuff different things, right? So, Khalifa Kush, OG. Sorry, what was that, Joe?
It's the same shit, different mix, different name.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that's interesting to me is it has lasting power, right? And the reason that agriculture, right? Cannabis is just agriculture, right? It's plants, right? We're growing plants and selling the products, and cannabis flower is like a farmer's market product, right? It has, short shelf life. You can't keep it around unless you process it, unless you make frozen zucchini or whatever, because the zucchinis go bad after a little while. But ultimately, we had all these names because people wanted to differentiate their product. Hold on one second. They wanted to differentiate their cannabis from everybody else's that might be growing the same thing. Nowadays you'd probably go like Nishan's Farms OG Kush, right? Or Karassik Farms OG Kush, and then it would be Pietri Farms OG Kush. And we know that we're growing the same thing, but you just happen to like Joe's OG Kush better than mine. But because it was underground, you couldn't do that, so you changed the name. But then everybody else changed the name when Joe's became popular, right? So then it creates kind of all kinds of problems, but even change the name, happens in agriculture too. Someone sells the end run of some seeds or whatnot of, some apple or cuts of apple and they want to create a different silo, so they rebrand it something else. And so now they're the same apples being sold under two different names.
Right. That's just what's happening. That's why I'm really going to thank you again, Nishan. I've had some fabulous ideas for business. Now we're talking to you, but it was just so good that you're here on because on a podcast, because the real information gets out and people want to hear the truth. They're tired of being lied to by High Times and all the other Dutch marketing fraud and the whole thing. I mean, they were using two sons to grow weed.
While we've got you here, Nishan, you really sound like a really reasonable person and a pragmatic person too. As a medical grower and stuff, and we get kind of the back end of information sometimes, and we've heard a lot of stuff about Phylos, I don't know what's all true, so what would you say are like some misconceptions about, maybe the things that have happened?
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to say anything you don't want to. I'm just saying.
Well, no. And I just don't want, I don't want to flare anything up,
For sure.
The thing is that, people, unfortunately, there was some misplaced aggression, I think. And cannabis is rough, right? Like the families that I grew up around, and legalization was not pretty for the incumbents, right? The incumbents get displaced when there's major changes, and so it's scary, right? Like, especially DNA itself is kind of scary. Just if you don't, it's Jurassic Park, right? That's some scary stuff. But Jurassic Park, it really is sort of still a dream. They are trying to do some crazy stuff, but you can't really bring dead tissue back to life, And so there were some rumors that we could, we got our samples and we stole people's stuff, or that we were trying to patent their stuff, and that's just not possible, right? I mean, the real reason that we started breeding was because people that we wanted to do it with people that were growers, and they, they were focused on production, right? And it costs a lot of money to create new things that have interesting traits. That takes a lot of space and time and a different way of doing things. And when you're focused and your cash flow depends on a crop, you can't dedicate that. And so people weren't interested in doing it really. And we just had the DNA, which is pretty useless unless you're growing the plants, because you can't tell what actually is a real trait or not, because no one's using the same name. And so you have to measure the plants themselves. You have to grow them to understand what the traits are, so that you understand what the DNA is doing, right? So you can't do anything with DNA, and you can't patent based on just DNA. You have to actually do work, real work, and that requires you to grow plants and measure those plants and improve those plants, right? And there's many ways to do it, and there's not a, there's fast ways and there's slow ways, but a dedicated breeder is can do amazing things, right? It just was, I think there was a lot of fear. There was a huge depression in the market, in the cannabis market at the time. It's a compliment to how we were viewed in some ways. It was a little hurtful, right? People thought that we could do things that, we just can't do, or, it's just not possible to do. Even though I'd love to be a magician, right? It just is not possible. And so yeah, I mean, we're just regular, smart, interested, curious group that's trying to improve things and make interesting stuff.
But I finally get it though, because like here in Oklahoma, you have a lot of commercial farmers. And so they're it's when they're going out to buy plants and get clones and create mothers, they're it's a hit or miss thing. You got to have everybody in place. But like people here, they grow a lot of autoflower here. They have huge greenhouses, 30 by 1,000, 30 by 100. Like 17, 18, and they're all growing like auto flowers and basically bunk, so there is a market for the good stuff. There is a market for the good stuff. Somebody's growing some good stuff, some feminized stuff that's good. You know what I mean? And when you play in Europe, it's hit or miss.
Well, the thing about autoflower, right, that's interesting is that it's you cannot depend on a clone to keep around your winning clone. It dies off, and so you have to take it to the next generation. And so that's a completely different way. It just means that you actually have to breed plants in a sort of a line breeding method, because you can't keep them around. And so it requires to get really good plants, that are above 20% potency, that have hybrid vigor and all of those things. You end up having to put the work in, right? And not to say that other people aren't putting the work in; it's just putting it in differently. So yeah, I mean, but getting consistent, uniform autoflowers that are above 20-25% is pretty rewarding, right?
Well, it's good enough.
Yeah, and yeah, and when you can harvest it 75 days from planting the seed, that's pretty amazing. Yeah. And you don't have to schwaz it, or you don't have to do anything. You just plant them really densely together. And a lot of, I mean, and there's junk biomass, but when you can get 50 to 60% A flower, it's great.
Oh yeah.
What would you say some of the most interesting stuff that you got to take a look at the data from, like different strains from around the world?
Well, the data is never really as interesting as the plants, but looking at sort of the population, which is everybody has access to it, right? The same stuff that we do. I mean, I just find some of these things interesting, like whether that's, okay, let me tell you, there was a cool, I'm just going to tell you some cool stories around the galaxy, I guess, that kind of interesting. Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear.
There's one called Dalat, I think, Dalata, D-L-A-T-A, I think.
Dalata.
Yeah, and it's Brazilian, and a guy came, called me up and came and visited us at a conference. Flew up from Brazil, and I got some samples from him and a story. And there's a couple of people working on documentaries of it, but it was like if you look up in the galaxy, you can find it, or the strain search, you can find it. But it's a great story. A bunch of weed got thrown overboard, 2 kilo cans, and then it washed up on shore and created a huge sort of creative art scene in Brazil in the 80s. Just changed the culture. And
I remember. I know that story. That's a true story.
Yeah, you
That's
can.
A true story.
And you see that sample that's connected to a lot of Southeast Asian and Thai plants.
Yeah, those were Thai plants.
Yeah.
Yeah, those were Thai plants. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a cool story where, science proves the story, kind of, right? There's I think it's called Miss You in there from Mississippi University.
Yeah.
It happened to be a sequence of a plant that was still being sent out as samples. It happens to have skunk in it, right? But that's just because, the University of Mississippi was grabbing anything that was available.
They
Yeah,
had
we've
skunk in
talked
it
about that
because
on-
everything has skunk.
Well, that one probably actually has skunk, right? Because Watson sold a lot of skunk #1
He
seeds.
got them from Carlton Turner. But when
No,
you're
no.
1879 ballast, it shows that skunk was around.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, it was, I mean, the skunk, the sequences that make up the skunk group were around. Skunk itself is just a plant, right?
It's
Or
much
a-
more vague, it's much more vague than we've thought, It sounds
yeah. I mean, and really think of those labels as arbitrary, right? That's #1, #2, #3, #4, #5. Those are groupings. And just-
Watson, he changed from when he was in high school. His name was Jingles when he was in college. Then he became the Skunk Man, and now he's Seed Sensei.
Okay, I don't know anything about it. I try to stay out of the war part, and I just try to focus on the interesting
Smart of
things
you.
of cannabis.
It's a whole mess, and honestly, I think at the end of the day, the truth is always going to be somewhere in the middle, and as passionate as I am about these old school skunks and stuff, I also realize that I don't know everything, and
Yeah.
it's
Oh,
all
of course.
hard to really know anything because, we're reading. I mean, there's people like Joe who've lived it, but for the most part, people haven't,
Yeah, no, exactly. No, I mean, Joe's been around a long time. A lot of, there's a lot of old timers have been around. I now, I guess, considered an old timer. I was growing weed on the hills in Oregon in like 1985. But, I mean, it was a little different in those days, and the drug war was going on, but yeah, I don't know. It's there's been a lot of change, right? And legalization, is like I was saying before, it does hurt the incumbent, the people who made money off of it in that time, right? And had continued to make money. The positive aspect of it, even though you get, all of the, some of the negative stuff as well, corporate stuff that's, whatever, only profit or all of that stuff. You do have people who can smoke weed and not get arrested. And to me, if we're all in love with the plant, right? If we think that it has positive characteristics, more people being able to consume that and get a little bit of that more out there in everyday life seems like a positive, even though it does hurt some people. And I mean, that's change, and that's it's unfortunate for everybody, and the people that I know that have disrupted ultimately, right? But it is positive for the larger set of people that now get to consume it without being afraid. I mean, that was a big deal.
So how do we push cannabis in the right direction in the future, do you think? I mean, is it going back to landrace genetics like Joe is so passionate about doing? I mean, is it educating ourselves more? What do you think about individual cannabinoid sequencing?
Oh, I mean, there will be, gosh, I mean, there's some really interesting stuff, right? Like,
we sequence our own cannabinoid system, and so we can see.
Oh, the endocannabinoid system. Gosh, I don't, there's just so little research. I think the Israelis are way ahead of us on the medical side of understanding the interaction between our system and the various compounds in cannabis, right? I mean, cannabinoids are just one part of it, and very little is even known about that, right? We've got the top 10, and most people probably can't even name the top 10, but there's 120, 108, I don't know how many cannabinoids there are. And then there's
been about 10, 15 picked out, named, or separated.
Well, I think Yeah, there's probably more than that, I think, but I mean, they're all, yeah, but still, that's a huge area that's pretty cool, right? I don't think that those are really inside of the modern cannabis population, just because we've selected for only THC, right? We don't consume it in a diverse population of plants, like hash making might, or other larger processing might allow, or traditional methods might allow. But I mean, there's a lot of areas for people to do interesting things, right? It's just, and everybody can find a niche, I think, that is interesting. I don't know the days of being able to grow anything at any quality are probably gone, right? Because ultimately we're getting paid for risk, not for quality. There's a bit of a difference for quality, but not as much as the payment for risk.
I never really thought about that until you just said it, to be honest, but it's so true.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm conflicted, because we were getting paid for risk, and we all wanted the people to smoke cannabis because we liked it, right? But ultimately we were benefiting from it, from other people getting arrested. I mean, not directly, but that was actually the thing.
Yeah. You think cannabis has lost its mystery in a way?
Yeah.
The legalization of cannabis is a crime against humanity.
It's funny because my kids are like, I come from a bit more of the paranoid days, right? And my kids, I have, I grow my personal plants here and whatnot, and I'm like, oh no, your friends are coming over. Don't tell me before they come over. And they look at me and they're like, dude, everybody's growing weed.
Well, at least you don't have to be paranoid,
Yeah, exactly. So I'm like, okay, well that makes me feel better. Okay. But
it's still awkward though, for sure. I mean, I have kids and it's like they're nowhere near the age of smoking, but when I think, even though I'm very free and passionate about cannabis, I'm still going to feel weird about it when they enter that phase.
Yeah, I mean, it is a compound that alters our perceptions, right? I mean, just like anything, it can be, abused, not in the way that it's going to maybe hurt us as much, but like everything in moderation, so to speak, right? So like those are good lessons to teach your kid, right? There was a funny, I talked to a nurses event early on, when cannabis first legalized, and they were, a lot of the questions at that time were, like, what about the children? And I just told a story that, there was a physician, just because they were nurses, they knew it, that was being called upon, and this is a true story, called upon to sort of talk about the abuse of really cannabis in a home. It wasn't abuse, but and so the interview of the kid was, well, do your parents, and I altered the story, but do your parents consume around you? Yeah. Well, do you know where it's at, and do you know how to access it? And they said, yeah. And then they said, well, so how much alcohol do they have, is where I altered the story. And the nurses were like, what? And ultimately,
they used to do that I forget the organization, but if you turn your parents in, oh, does your parents smoke pot? Does your daddy, and that was the way. And kids got their parents busted. That actually happened.
Right? Yeah.
That would suck so bad.
Yeah. Well,
Their program.
Yeah.
Imagine you're a kid and you just got your parents arrested for pot, and your dad goes to jail, and your mom's on probation, and
Oh gosh.
Jeez.
It's not funny, but it's crazy how the drug war has played out.
Yeah. I mean, as a kid, you know, we had whatever drug education, right, in like 7th grade or something. And to me, you know, you could go a couple of ways with it, but to me, they were, you know, like marijuana is bad, you know, all the things, whatever. And I was like, you know what? I know a lot of people that smoke cannabis, and so they don't act like that, and they seem actually pretty happy to me. And so then I'm like, what else are they lying to me about? Not in a drug way, but just in terms of generally. I was like, this is a weird scenario, right?
Yeah, it sounds strange, for sure. Yeah.
Hey, I should jump. I got another call.
All right, man. Thank you for
thanks for
coming
joining
up,
us,
buddy.
man.
I really appreciate it. And I'll give you a call after the weekend.
Okay, talk to you guys later.
Take care.
Later. So, Jeff, that was great, man.